Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Professor, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We are going to discuss today a module from the paper Introduction to Linguistics. The coordinator of the module is Professor R. Amritavalli, retired professor from EFL University, Hyderabad. The name of the module is Philosophy of Language, Austin, Searle, Wittgenstein, Quine. The module has been authored by Professor Amritavalli herself.
Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. Today we'll discuss the module Philosophy of Language. In this module, we'll try to introduce and discuss some philosophical issues and assumptions in the current linguistic enterprise. By now, you would know about Chomsky's mentalist approach to language and how it contrasted with Skinner's empiricist view of language as learned behavior. The rationalist and empiricist approaches to the problem of language and knowledge more generally reflect an ongoing philosophical debate through the ages to question about the nature of our knowledge and its acquisition. Now, the question is, how do we know what we know? And this question has been answered in two ways. That is, one, we know what we know because the world is structured in a particular way, and in our interactions with the world, we connect to understand its structure. And the second explanation to this question is that we know what we know because our brains are structured in a certain way. And this structure predisposes us to see certain patterns in the world, whether through our senses or through our understanding of concepts like cause and effect, right and wrong, the dimensions of space and time, and so on. Traditionally, an area referred to as the philosophy of language encompasses a set of approaches to language. In this module, we'll briefly discuss the work of Austin and Searle, often referred to in current work in language and its acquisition. Searle tells us that the philosophy of language is the attempt to give philosophically illuminating descriptions of certain general features of language, such as reference, truth, meaning, and necessity. Its method of investigation is to pay strict attention to the facts of actual natural languages, but the conclusions based on this data, if they are valid, should hold for any possible language. The philosophy of language has been concerned with meaning and therefore with synonymy, defined as having the same meaning. One branch of philosophy is called analytic philosophy. A statement is analytic if and only if it is true in virtue of its meaning or by definition. So, for example, let's look at the sentences. Rectangles are four-sided, or all bachelors are unmarried. So these sentences are analytic in nature as they are true in their meanings. Philosophers have been interested in the question of reference. Referring expressions point to particular things. They answer the questions who, what, which. And there is a distinction between sense and reference as well. For example, let's say the planet Venus appears in the sky before sunrise and after sunset. Noticing it in the morning, we call it a morning star, and noticing it in the evening, we call it an evening star. And then suppose we then say the morning star is the evening star. So in this sentence, the different description in this sentence both refer to Venus, but they are different in their sense. Searle sums up the traditional discussion of reference in two generally recognized axioms concerning referring and referring expressions. Now we can formulate them in such a way that whatever is referred to must exist. Also, now let's call this axiom of existence. And then we have the axiom of identity, that is, if a predicate is true of an object, it is true of anything identical with that object, regardless of what expressions are used to refer to that object. So we can formulate this reference in terms of two axioms, that is, axioms of existence and axioms of identity. Axioms of existence says that whatever is referred to must exist, and the axiom of identity says that if a predicate is true of an object, it is true of anything identical with that object, regardless of what expressions are used to refer to that object. He then points out that both these axioms gives rise to paradoxes. We shall consider here only the problem of what it means to refer. Suppose we say the golden mountain does not exist. But if the words the golden mountain are used to refer, then by axiom 1, the golden mountains must exist. That is, if we are considering the axiom of existence, then the golden mountain must exist. The problem is that in order to deny the existence of anything, it must exist. Then the statement becomes self-defeating, or in order to state it, it must be false. One solution is to say that the subject of an existential sentence cannot be used to refer, and therefore existence is not a property. Other apparent counterexamples to axiom 1 are fictional, legendary, or mythological entities. So Searle suggests that one can refer to them as fictional characters precisely because they do exist in fiction. Now, Searle also says that the notion of definite reference and the cognate notion of definite referring expression like precise boundaries. One can give a set of sentences containing such expressions to illustrate the paradigm cases of definite reference, but there will still be many cases where one is in doubt. For example, in signing one's name to a document, does one refer to oneself, or do tensed verbs refer to the time of their utterance, etc.? So he suggests to examine those cases which constitute the center of variation of the concept of referring, and then examine the borderline cases in light of their similarities and differences from the paradigm. He then tells us that the paradigmatic referring expressions in English fall into three classes as far as the surface structure of English sentence is concerned. And these various classes are proper names, noun phrases beginning with the definite article or a possessive pronoun or noun, and followed by a singular noun and pronoun. So we'll look at all these. First is proper names, and we'll all know the examples for proper names. For example, Aristotle, Russia, Socrates, Delhi, etc. Next is complex noun phrases in the singular, and this includes phrases like the highest mountain in the world, or the man who called, or then we have France's present crisis. So all these phrases are definite descriptions. They have complex noun phrases in the singular. A definite description may contain another definite description or a proper name. For example, the woman who is married to the man who is drunk, or let's say John's brother. So these are definite descriptions which contains another definite description or a proper noun. Next we have pronouns such as this, that, I, he, she, it, they, etc. And then we have titles such as the Prime Minister or the Pope, etc. Which these can be treated as definite descriptions or as proper names. Searle treats reference as a speech act, and we'll now discuss more on the idea of speech acts. J.L. Austin was an Oxford philosopher of the 20th century. In his William James lectures delivered at Harvard University in 1955, Austin proposed the idea that the utterance is a speech act. Austin begins with the problem that there are sentences in language that look like statements but whose meaning cannot be evaluated on the basis of truth or falsity. And these utterances do not report or describe anything. Rather, the uttering of the sentence is a part of the doing of an action. So some of Austin's examples of such sentences are, for example, let's say, I named this ship the Queen Elizabeth, or I give my watch to my brother, or I bet you 6 pence it will rain tomorrow. So in all these sentences, what happens is it looks like a statement, but they do not report or describe anything. Instead, they just, they're part of doing an action. Austin proposes to call a sentence or utterance of this type a performative sentence or a performative utterance, or let's say it is also called as a performative. The name is derived from perform, the usual verb with the noun action. It indicates that the issuing of the utterance is the performance of an action. It is not normally thought of as just saying something. Austin also observed that it is always necessary that the circumstances in which the words are uttered should be in some way appropriate, and it is very commonly necessary that either the speaker himself or other persons should also perform certain other actions, whether physical or mental actions, or even acts of uttering further words. When one or another of the normal concomitants of a performative utterance is absent, the act is void or not implemented, and so on. For example, if the words of the marriage ceremony, that is pronouncing a couple man and wife, are uttered by a layperson who, unlike a priest or a magistrate, has no powers to perform the marriage, then the marriage is not valid. Thus, the act of performing the marriage is voided. Most performatives have a first person singular or plural subject, but Austin also gives us examples with second and third person subjects. For example, we can look at the sentences or phrases. You're hereby authorized to pay. So here we have a second person subject. And then let's look at the next sentence. Passengers are warned to cross the track by the bridge only. So in both these cases, the performative have a second person or a third person subject. Now, the verb may even be impersonal in such cases with the passive. For example, notice is hereby given that trespassers will be prosecuted. So here, the verb is impersonal and is with passive. In writing, according to Austin, the word hereby is a useful criteria that the utterance is performative. But there is no simple criteria for grammar or vocabulary that identifies an utterance as a performative. Now we'll discuss more about performatives in oral societies. Austin's clarification that example of written language can be classified as performatives is of interest when we consider that writing is only about 5,000 years old, but societies had evolved much before that. We can call such societies preliterate societies. And societies today are normatively literate, and in such societies it is the written word that codifies the letter of the law. But in pre-literate societies, it is the oral performative that is also the law, and there can be no laws codified in writing in a society where writing does not exist. but there can exist codified forms of speech that are accompanied by an action, speech, action, and witnessing of these two. Altogether signify that an event has taken place. Now, this is a point made by Ivan and Barry Sanders in their book ABC, The Alphabetization of the Popular Mind. They point out that in pre-literate societies, land transactions such as transfer, sale, or acquisition of land had to be made orally, and the words were accompanied by an act. The reason why the marriage ceremony has words, action, and witnesses can now be understood. In today's context, however, the oral performative act of the marriage ceremony has to be reinforced by the registration of marriage in writing. We'll now try to understand three facets of an utterance, that is locution, elocution, and perlocution. These were distinguished by Austin. The locution or the locutionary act is the act of saying something, and the elocution or the elocutionary act is the performance of an act such as asking or answering a question, giving some information or an assurance or a warning, announcing a verdict or an intention, pronouncing sentence, making an appointment or an appeal or a criticism. Or it can also include making an identification or giving a description. The perlocution or perlocutionary act, on the other hand, includes the achieving of certain effects by saying something. Saying something will often or normally produce certain consequential effects upon the feelings, thoughts, or actions of the audience or of the speaker or of other persons. So precisely what we can understand is that the locutionary act has a meaning, the elocutionary act has a certain force, and the perlocutionary act is the achieving of certain effects. In this module, we learned how is the philosophy of language an attempt to give philosophically illuminating descriptions of certain general features of language such as reference, truth, meaning, and necessity. We also learned that the philosophy of language has been concerned with meaning and therefore with synonymy. I hope this module helped you in understanding the concepts of analytic philosophy and speech acts. Thank you.
Summary. So we have listened to the discussion of the philosophy of language. The philosophy of language is the attempt to give philosophically illuminating descriptions of certain general features of language, such as reference, truth, meaning, and necessity, which were discussed in detail in the module. The method of investigation is to pay strict attention to the facts of actual natural languages. However, the conclusions based on this data, if they are valid, should hold for any possible language. The aim of philosophy of language, the goal of philosophy of language, thus is complementary to the goal of linguistic theory today. Thank you.